Today we're going to talk about nutation and the pelvis. First of all, let's just get a basic idea of the landscape of the pelvis. So as you can see, it's quite open in the front. It has these two hip bones on either side, and in the back, coming between it, is the end of the spine that is like calcified up and thickened up to become the sacrum, which is basically a triangle that sits like a wedge in between the two sides of the pelvis. If you look at the pelvis from the end, you'll see that in actual fact, it sits closer to the surface of the pelvis back here, and then there's actually quite a deep area of a groove here, and that the sacrum is actually tilted forward just a little bit, have these two posterior edges of the pelvis sticking up a fair bit. And in fact, if you brought the sacrum back, which is what happens when we do backward bends, it actually, because of that angle, would push these apart a little bit. And so you actually end up getting a little bit of a movement of the pelvis as you do a back bend, of the two sides getting pushed out a little bit like this. And as we do a forward bend, because the sacrum moves forward between these two sides of the pelvis, these two sides actually fall in towards center a little bit because they get less support from the sacrum in the middle. So there's actually a movement when you go backward bend and you go forward bend of the pelvis actually moving just a little bit inward at the top when we do a forward bend, and outward at the top when we do a backward bend. This doesn't make a lot of difference here. It's not a lot of movement that the sacrum is making as it nods back and forth, what's called nutation in the science. But what happens at the bottom end, where these sit bones are, is that the sit bones are actually the balance point for the pelvis. Like if you were to sit in a chair and you feel your sit bones, that is the point at which you're right in the center of the pelvis. Therefore, you're going to support the spine, and to sit properly erect in a chair, if you find your sit bones and balance back and forth until you find the equal place on them, that is the center point of your pelvis and therefore of your posture. You'll find your posture tends to try to automatically correct when it is sitting right on the sit bones. So this is a pivot point for the pelvis, and it is also the place, because it's so far down below the sacrum, that it's got a little bit of a radius, more of a radius range. So in actual fact, when you do a forward bend and the top part falls in a bit, these two sit bones will actually come out a little bit. Now I'm going to show you what this would end up looking like if you were to try it yourself for a moment. So you can test this yourself by putting your fingers on your sit bones, located right about here, and you'll find that as you go forward, your fingers actually start to migrate apart as the pelvis starts to tilt inward at the top, and therefore the sit bones come out at the bottom. When you come up and go backwards, they will actually scrunch in toward center a little bit. So there's a really important movement that's happening in the pelvis that is affecting the way that, for example, when you do a forward bend, how much you can give into that forward bend also is dependent to some extent on how much that pelvic floor can open up as those two sides of the pelvis start to come apart a little bit. The more tension that's sitting in the pelvic floor, the more it's going to limit the movement that the pelvis can do this, and it's going to have one of the influences on how much you can go into a forward bend. The musculature of the pelvic floor, it's a very important part of the effect of the movement of that tilting inward and outward, because right at the middle of where those sit bones are is actually the center also of where the musculature comes across your pelvis. In the front is all the urogenital region, and in the back is the anal region. And they basically are two triangles, one that comes from the tailbone and goes forward to this area, comes at a triangle. The base is right at the sit bone area, and then another triangle which goes forward to the pubic bone, which is the urogenital area. And so when you have tension in either of these two areas, so think, for example, the anal area, that could be around hemorrhoids, for example. And in the front, it may be that there's been some issues with prolapse. But also right in the center is this area that between the two regions that we call the perineal area. And so people who have had, for example, episiotomies during childbirth may find there's a little bit more scar tissue there, and that also can limit the movement that happens in this area. So we are going to start with our movement going down into the legs by working with these areas in the pelvis to help them open up and to help them become more responsive to the work that we'll do going down into the hamstrings, which come and attach on the back part of this sit bone or ischial tuberosity right here. If you put the body upward, you can see that the hamstrings are coming up from here and attaching right on to the front part of these ischial tuberosities. And therefore, the more this can open up, the more that these can open up and let go. Also, the adductors, this direction of fiber movement through the muscles comes right through into the adductors and down into the inside of the thigh. So there are lots of reasons why getting mobility here becomes a really important part of the mobility that happens through the pelvis.